The air in the room is cool, almost cold, but the man sitting in the Florida State Prison interview room doesn't seem to notice the chill. He is handsome, in a way that seems almost manufactured, with dark, wavy hair, penetrating eyes that can shift in an instant from warmth to a vacant, chilling void, and a confident, almost charming smile that has disarmed dozens before. His name is Theodore Robert Cowell, though the world knows him as Ted Bundy, and he is about to speak. His words a carefully curated mix of truth, lies, and grotesque performance. To understand the path that led him here, to this sterile room on the brink of the electric chair, we must not simply list his crimes, but we must walk the path with him, through the sunshine and the shadows, into the very heart of a darkness that wore a human face. We must go back to the very beginning, to a time when the name Ted Bundy meant nothing at all. His story starts not with a bang, but with a whisper of shame in a Philadelphia maternity home. He was born to Eleanor Louise Cowell on November 24, 1946. The circumstances of his birth were the first secret, the first layer of a fractured identity. His birth certificate listed no father, and to avoid the scandal of illegitimacy, his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, took him in and raised him as their own in Burlington, Vermont. For years, Ted believed his mother was his sister. The man he thought was his father, Samuel Cowell, was a tyrannical and bigoted figure, a man whose rage could fill a room. Ted would lie in bed at night and listen to the violence, the shouting, the sound of a world built on instability. And outside that house there was another rumor, a persistent whispering ghost that would follow him into adulthood. The suspicion that the man he called his father was, in fact, his biological father. The idea that he was the product of an incestuous union, a profound and unspeakable transgression, was a poison that seeped into his soul. Was it true? We may never know for certain, but for Ted, the suspicion was a cancer, a foundational crack in his sense of self. The family eventually moved to Tacoma, Washington, where his mother married a man named Johnny Bundy. Ted took his surname, and on the surface, the all-American family was complete. But the boy who emerged from that turbulent early life was a collection of contradictions. To his teachers and peers, he was shy, almost painfully so, awkward in social situations. He was a boy who would blush easily, a boy who seemed to live inside his own head. But beneath that shy exterior was a roiling sea of insecurity and a burgeoning, terrifying fantasy life. He would later speak of an entity growing inside him, a malignant presence that he felt was separate from the good Ted, the Ted who volunteered for political campaigns, the Ted who was studying to be a lawyer, the Ted who everyone liked. His first foray into the world of crime was petty, a secret life of shoplifting and burglary. But it was during his adolescence that a darker pattern began to emerge. He developed a fascination with control, with the possession of things, and later, people. He would sneak into bedrooms at night and watch women sleep, a silent, unseen voyeur, drinking in their vulnerability. He would remove articles of clothing from their homes, not to sell, but to keep, to possess a piece of them. These were the rehearsals, the dry runs for the horrors to come. He was learning the geography of predation, the thrill of crossing a boundary without being seen. While attending the University of Washington, he met a woman who would become one of the great obsessions of his life. She was beautiful, sophisticated, from a wealthy California family. She was everything Ted Bundy, the poor boy from Tacoma with a shameful secret, believed he was not. He fell for her completely, molding himself into the man he thought she wanted. But the relationship was volatile, built on his insecurities and her eventual disillusionment. when she finally ended it, the rejection was a nuclear detonation in his psyche. It confirmed his deepest fear that he was inherently unworthy, the illegitimate boy from the wrong side of the tracks. In the wake of that rejection, the entity began to stir, to demand more than just stolen lingerie and furtive glances through windows. The first known attack that bore the horrific signature of the entity occurred on January 4th, 1974, in Seattle. It was a cold, dark night at the basement-level bedroom of 18-year-old Joni Lenz. She was asleep when a figure slipped into her room. He took a metal rod from her bed frame and bludgeoned her repeatedly in the head. He then violated her with the same rod, causing catastrophic internal injuries. Miraculously, Joni Lenz survived, though she was left with permanent physical and emotional scars. The attack was so brutal, so senseless, that it baffled police. They had no frame of reference for it. They didn't know they were looking at the opening move of a grand, monstrous design. Just a few weeks later, on the night of January 31st, 1974, another University of Washington student, Linda Ann Healy, vanished from her basement bedroom. She was a popular, bright psychology major and a ski instructor. One moment she was there, a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The next, she was gone. The only clues were a small bloodstain on her pillowcase and the eerie silence of her abandoned room. Linda Ann Healy was the first to disappear, the first to become a name on a missing persons poster, a photograph held by a grieving family. But she would not be the last. The entity was now hunting, and it had found its method: the swift, silent abduction of young women from places they believed were safe. The spring and summer of 1974 became a season of terror in Washington state. The disappearances came in a relentless, horrifying wave. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College, vanished on March 12th while walking to a jazz concert on campus. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared on April 17th from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Her glasses were found later, broken, on the ground. On May 6th, Kathy Parks, a 22-year-old student at Oregon State University, went missing after leaving her dorm to walk to a concert. Just 3 weeks later, on May 31st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, vanished after leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington. Her car was found abandoned, the keys still in the ignition. Then, on June 11th, the horror escalated to an almost unimaginable degree. Jorgen Hawkins, a 18-year-old University of Washington student, was walking back to her sorority house from her boyfriend's dorm late at night. She was only a block away from the safety of the Alpha Phi house when she was taken. The attack was audacious, happening in the heart of the university district. Ted Bundy, the entity, was growing bolder, more confident in his methods. He was perfecting his craft. The investigation was sprawling, involving multiple police jurisdictions, but it was going nowhere. There were no witnesses, no useful forensic evidence, no clear motive. The police were chasing a ghost. They didn't know that the man they were looking for was not a shambling, monstrous-looking creature from a horror movie. He was a handsome, articulate, and charming young man who was, at that very moment, working at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and volunteering at a suicide hotline. He was the man who would stop to help a woman carry her groceries, the man who dated your sister, the man who sat next to you in class. He was the perfect camouflage. The entity, however, was not content to stay in Washington. In July of 1974, it traveled south to Utah. On October 2nd, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox vanished in Holiday. On October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Smith the daughter of the Midvale police chief, disappeared after going to a party. Her body was found 9 days later in the mountains near Summit Park. She had been brutally beaten, raped and strangled with her own pantyhose. The horror was now coupled with a profound personal agony for the investigators. On October 31st, Halloween night, 17-year-old Laura Amy was abducted from a high school Halloween dance in Lehigh. Her body was found weeks later. She had suffered a similar savage fate. The police in Utah were now facing the same nightmare as their counterparts in Washington. They knew they were dealing with a serial predator, but the connections between the states were tenuous, the patterns elusive. The break, when it came, was almost absurdly mundane. On the evening of November 8, 1974, in the suburbs of Salt Lake City, a man driving a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle attempted to abduct 18-year-old Carol DeRonch from a shopping mall. He had identified himself as a police officer, told her someone had been trying to break into her car, and convinced her to accompany him to the station to file a report. He was smooth, authoritative, but once she was in his car, the mask slipped. He produced a handcuff and snapped one bracelet onto her wrist. In a moment of sheer, life-saving instinct, Carol DeRonch fought back. She struggled, screamed, and managed to fling herself out of the moving car. She escaped, leaving behind one handcuff still locked on her wrist. She was the one who got away. Just minutes later, and a few miles away, the entity struck again. He entered the Viewmont High School auditorium during a performance. He was looking for another victim. He saw 17-year-old Debbie Kent, who had stepped outside to meet her brother. He abducted her from the school parking lot. Debbie Kent vanished, never to be seen alive again. But this time, he had been sloppy. Witnesses saw a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle speeding away from the school, and one of them had written down a partial license plate number. The net was finally beginning to close. The description from Carol DeRonch and the Volkswagen lead gave Utah police their first tangible suspect. They began a massive search for every light-colored VW Beetle in the state. Meanwhile, Ted Bundy, the man, was continuing his double life. He was a star student at the University of Utah Law School, dating a woman named Liz Klepfer, who knew him as a kind, if sometimes distant and moody, boyfriend. She had no idea that the man she shared a bed with was the monster terrorizing the region. On August 16, 1975, a police officer in Granger, Utah, named Bob Hayward, was on a routine patrol in his neighborhood late at night. He saw a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly, suspiciously. He ran the plates. The car came back registered to Theodore Bundy. When he approached the car, the driver was polite, cooperative, but Officer Hayward was a seasoned cop, and his instincts were screaming. He asked to look in the trunk. Bundy, ever the charmer, agreed. Inside, Officer Hayward found a terrifying inventory: a ski mask, an ice pick, a crowbar, a coil of rope, and a pair of handcuffs. It was a kidnapper's kit. Ted Bundy was placed under arrest. The evidence seemed compelling. Carol DeRonch positively identified him in a lineup. Fibers from his car matched fibers found on Melissa Smith's body. The handcuffs on Carol DeRonch's wrist were linked to a pair found in his possession. In March 1976, Ted Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. It was a victory, but a small one. The authorities in Washington and Colorado, where a series of similar murders had occurred, knew they had their man for the bigger crimes. They began the process of extraditing him to stand trial for murder, but the entity was not ready to be caged. On June 7, 1977, while being transported to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell, Bundy was taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse for a pre-trial hearing. Seizing a moment of inattention, he asked to use the law library. He then jumped from a second-story window, spraining his ankle but otherwise escaping into the mountains. For 6 days, he was a fugitive, living off his wits and the terrain, a fox being hunted by hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers. He was cold, hungry, and desperate. But he was free. And then, on June 13th, they found him, exhausted and shivering in a stolen car. He was recaptured. The first escape had failed. He was now considered an extreme flight risk. Security was tightened. He was placed in a more secure cell in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. But Ted Bundy's mind was his most powerful weapon. He spent months studying the jail's layout, the routines of the guards, the weaknesses in the system. He had lost weight, over 30 pounds, by subsisting on a diet of oranges and water, making himself thin enough to fit through a small, inaccessible-looking opening. On the night of December 30th, 1977, he put his plan into action. He had sawed through the metal plate, covering a light fixture in the ceiling of his cell, creating a hole just large enough for his newly slimmed body to squeeze through. He climbed up into the crawl space above his cell, navigated the dusty, dark space between the ceiling and the roof, and dropped down into a janitor's closet in an adjacent, unused part of the jail. He then simply walked out of the building. His second escape was a masterpiece of patience and planning. He was free again. This time he had a plan. He stole a car and drove, not into the wilderness, but east across the country. He made his way to Tallahassee, Florida. He took on a new identity, calling himself Chris Hagen, and rented a room near the Florida State University campus. For a few weeks, he lived a quiet, anonymous life, but the entity was starving. It had been caged for over 2 years, and now was free in a new hunting ground, a campus teeming with young women. The pressure was building. The fantasies were becoming demands. The entity was about to unleash a frenzy of violence so savage it would shock a nation already numb to his crimes. The night of January 14th, 1978, was a cold one in Tallahassee. At the Chi Omega sorority house, just a few blocks from where Ted Bundy was living, the sisters were settling in for the night. It was a typical Saturday evening, filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the easy camaraderie of young women on the cusp of their lives. They felt safe behind the locked doors of their stately house. They had no way of knowing that a monster was already inside. Sometime after 3 a.m., Ted Bundy, armed with a heavy oak club he had fashioned himself, slipped into the sorority house. He moved through the darkened hallways with a predator's silence. He entered the room of Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20. He bludgeoned them both with the club with such ferocity that the sound was later described by one survivor as like someone hammering. He then bit Lisa Levy savagely on her buttocks and breasts, leaving distinct bite marks. He strangled Margaret Bowman with a pair of pantyhose. He then sexually assaulted Lisa Levy with a bottle of hairspray. The violence was explosive, personal, and frenzied. He left their room and moved down the hall to another, where he attacked Karen Chandler, 21, and Kathy Kleiner, 21. He beat them both with the club, fracturing their skulls and jaws, but they survived, their lives forever altered. He then left the sorority house as silently as he had entered. Just a few blocks away, he attacked another young woman, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment. He bludgeoned her so severely that she suffered permanent hearing loss and balance problems. The Tallahassee police were confronted with a crime scene of almost unprecedented brutality. The city was paralyzed with fear. The bite marks on Lisa Levy's body would later become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the entire case, a silent, grotesque signature. But the entity was not finished. Just a few weeks later, on February 9th, 1978, he traveled to Lake City, Florida. There, he encountered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a sweet-faced, vibrant child. She was on her way to school. Using the same charm he had used on Carol Durant and countless others, he lured her away. He took her to an abandoned pig shed in Suwannee State Park. What he did to her there was so horrific that the details were largely withheld from the public to protect the sensibilities of the community and her family. He murdered her, stabbing her to death and leaving her small, broken body in the shed. Kimberly Leach was his youngest known victim, and her death marked the end of his killing spree. The end began with a traffic stop. On February 15, 1978, just days after Kimberly Leach's disappearance, a Pensacola police officer noticed a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle driving through a residential area. When he tried to pull it over, the driver sped away. A chase ensued, ending when the Volkswagen crashed. The driver, who gave his name as Ken Missner, was arrested, but his fingerprints told a different story. They matched those of Theodore Robert Bundy, the most wanted man in America. The trial for the Chi Omega murders was a media circus, a national spectacle. Bundy, acting as his own co-counsel, used the courtroom as a stage. He was brilliant, manipulative, and theatrical. He cross-examined the surviving victims, trying to poke holes in their traumatic memories. He flirted with the female reporters in the gallery. He was putting on the performance of his life, trying to convince the jury and the world that he was the charming, wronged law student, not the monster who had bludgeoned those young women to death. But the evidence was overwhelming. The eyewitness who placed him near the sorority house that night, the fibers from his pants that matched fibers found in the sorority house, and most damning of all, the bite marks. The prosecution brought in a revolutionary forensic odontologist who presented photographs of the bites on Lisa Levy's body alongside plaster molds of Ted Bundy's teeth. The match was perfect, down to the unique chips and misalignments. It was as if he had signed his name on the victim with his own teeth. On July 23, 1979, the jury found him guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. 2 days later, they recommended the death penalty. The trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach followed, and the result was the same. Another death sentence. Ted Bundy was now on death row at the Florida State Prison, later known as Florida State Prison. The entity was finally, irrevocably caged. And this is where we began, in that cold interview room. In the years that followed his sentencing, Ted Bundy became a source of morbid fascination. He gave a series of interviews, most notably to the evangelical writer James Dobson and to a lawyer named Stephen Michaud, in which he finally began to talk about the crimes. He never offered a full, clean confession. His stories were always self-serving, a blend of partial truths, evasions, and outright lies. He blamed pornography. He blamed his childhood. He blamed the entity. He spoke of slipping into a fog, of being possessed by a force he could not control. He claimed he couldn't even remember the names of most of his victims, that they were just objects, props in his dark fantasies. He became a cause célèbre for the anti-death penalty movement, and he exploited it, filing appeal after appeal, delaying his execution for a decade. He even married a woman named Carol Ann Boone in a bizarre courtroom ceremony during one of his appeals, and she bore him a daughter. He was still manipulating, still performing, still trying to control the narrative until the very end. But the clock was ticking. As his final appeals were exhausted, the reality of the electric chair began to set in. In his final days, he became increasingly desperate. He reached out to the FBI profiler John Douglas, offering to help catch the Green River Killer in exchange for a stay of execution. It was a final, transparent ploy. He even gave a lengthy, rambling confession to the detective who had pursued him for so long, Bob Keppel. But even then, the details were vague, the numbers uncertain. The true number of his victims remains unknown, with estimates ranging from 30 to over 100. We will never know the full extent of the horror. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. The room was filled with witnesses, including some of the families of his victims. He was strapped into the wooden electric chair known as Old Sparky. His final words were not an apology to the families, not a moment of clarity for the lives he had destroyed. They were a rambling, self-pitying statement. He turned to the attorney for the Chi Omega victims, Bob Deckel, and said, "Give my love to my family and friends." He then looked out at the witnesses, his eyes vacant, and said, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The warden gave the signal. A hood was placed over his head. At 7:06 a.m., the first jolt of 2,000 volts surged through his body, his fists clenched, his body strained against the leather straps. A second jolt followed, and then a third. At 7:16 a.m., a doctor pronounced him dead. The entity was gone, but the scars he left on the world, the empty chairs at family dinners, the stolen futures, the lingering fear, those remained. The story of Ted Bundy is not a story of a brilliant criminal mastermind. It is the story of a weak, insecure man who fed a monster inside himself until it consumed him and dozens of innocent others. It is a story of the banality of evil, of how a handsome face can hide a fathomless darkness. And it is a warning that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones that hide in the shadows, but the ones who know how to walk in the light.